There is a question no one teaches you to ask, not in the years of schooling, not in the long apprenticeship of adulthood, and it is this: what if the world you inhabit is not a place you were born into, but a place you have been continuously, secretly building, not with your hands, not with your plans or your prayers, though prayers have their place, but with something so constant, so quietly omnipresent, that you stop noticing it the way a fish stops noticing water? Your thought. Not an idea here and there, not the thoughts you choose in careful moments, but the whole ceaseless weather of the inner life, the assumptions you carry into morning, the verdicts you render on yourself in unguarded seconds, the images that live in the space just behind your eyes when no one is asking you to perform. In 1903, a British writer named James Allen published a small book. It contained no diagrams, no prescriptions, no long argument. It was 64 pages. It has never gone out of print. As a Man Thinketh has been passed between strangers, pressed into the hands of the grieving, left on the bedsides of the searching for over a century, because something in it does not age. Something in it touches the thing that was always true, before philosophy named it, before science began to circle it. Tonight we open that book together, and we will read it the way it was always meant to be read, slowly, in the dark, with time enough to listen. We will move through this teaching in 13 chapters. Each one illuminates a single principle James Allen placed at the heart of his work, that the mind is not a passenger in your life, but its architect. You will encounter ideas that feel like memories, not because you have read them before, but because some part of you has always known them and has been waiting for the right words to bring them forward. As we journey deeper, a question will begin to form, one Allen planted in the very structure of his book, visible only once you have seen all the pieces. We will not name it yet, but by the time we reach the final pages of this narration, you will understand something about the nature of thought that most people live and die without ever clearly seeing. Stay with this until the end. What waits there is not a summary. It is a door. Chapter 1. The garden you did not know you were planting. Close your eyes for a moment, even as you listen. Picture, if you will, a garden. Not a garden of beauty or order, not the kind tended by careful hands and deliberate design. Picture instead a garden that has been growing in secret, behind a wall you forgot was there, in soil you did not choose but inherited, and then, through the slow accumulation of your days, made your own. This is the image James Allen places at the very opening of As a Man Thinketh, written in the first years of the 20th century by a man who had known poverty, grief, and long anonymity before he sat down to say the thing he had always known. The garden, Allen tells us, is the human mind, and every thought, not every grand intention, not every chosen belief, but every thought, including the careless ones, the habitual ones, the ones you have had so many times you no longer notice them, every thought is a seed. Some seeds we plant with awareness. We say, I will be patient. I will be generous. I will try again. And we feel in those moments like conscious gardeners. But most of what grows in us was never planted with such care. Most of it arrived the way wind-borne seeds arrive, without announcement, without permission, settling into whatever ground was soft enough to receive them. And then they grew. Slowly, below sight, they grew. There was, in an old city whose name has been worn smooth by time, a weaver of extraordinary cloth. She was renowned not for the brightness of her dyes or the complexity of her patterns, but for something her customers could never quite name. When they tried to describe her cloth to others, they said, "It feels like the person who made it. It carries a quality. It seems made from someone's interior life." A student once asked her the secret of this quality. She laughed, not unkindly. She said, "There is no secret. Only this I have woven every morning for 40 years. And before I touch the loom, I sit for 1 hour in the kind of silence where you can hear your own mind. I find what is living in me that day, and I weave from that. The cloth, she said, is never an accident. The cloth is always the record of what I brought to the loom. The student asked, but what if what you bring is grief, or anger, or fear? The weaver was quiet for a long time. Then she said, those too become cloth. All of it becomes cloth. This is why I learn to tend what I bring. Alan understood this with a precision that still startles. He wrote in the tradition the Hermetic Masters called the principle of correspondence, as within, so without, not as a mystical claim, but as an observable fact of human experience. The inner life does not stay inner. It presses outward through expression, through behavior, through the texture of decision, through what we attract and what we repel, through the way strangers perceive us before we have spoken a word. And yet most people, Alan observed, spend their lives managing the outer while leaving the inner ungoverned. They prune the visible branches while the roots run unchecked. They alter their circumstances while the thinking that generated those circumstances remains unchanged. And then they wonder why the same fruits keep appearing. The question he is really asking, the one that runs like an underground current through every page of his small book, is this: have you ever looked at your life not as something that happened to you, but as something that came from you? This is not a comfortable question. It is not meant to be. Here is what the tradition of the Upanishads calls the recognition that changes everything. The seer and the seen are not separate in the way we suppose. What we perceive is shaped by the instrument of perception. The mind that goes looking for confirmation of its unworthiness will find it in a crowded room. The mind that expects hostility reads neutral faces as threatening. The mind that carries a long conviction of lack will scan every landscape for evidence of what is missing, and the reverse is equally true, though it is harder to believe from inside the experience of difficulty. Alan is not saying that thought controls all events. He is not promising that positive thinking will reroute the weather. He is saying something more precise, more verifiable, and ultimately more useful, that the habitual character of your thought shapes your habitual character, and your habitual character is what your life is built from, day by day, choice by choice, response by response. The mind does not lie. It only keeps records. This is the first thing the garden teaches. What grows reveals what was planted. And the extraordinary news, the news Alan considered urgent enough to put into a book, is that the gardener is still alive. The gardener can still be awakened. The soil is never beyond reclaiming. This week, before any other practice, try this. At the end of one ordinary day, sit quietly for 10 minutes and ask yourself not what happened, but what you habitually thought. Notice whether you can. Notice what the noticing reveals. The garden you walk through each day is the one you have been planting, and you have always held the seeds. Chapter 2. Effect and Cause. The law hidden in plain sight. We are very comfortable, most of us, with the idea that the world acts upon us. The economy shifts and our security shifts with it. A diagnosis arrives and our entire future rearranges itself around that single word. Someone we love withdraws, and we feel the withdrawal as a wound that originated entirely outside ourselves. We are, in this familiar story, primarily respondents, primarily receivers. The world is the cause, and we are the effect. James Allen does not dispute that the world presses in. He was not a man who had been shielded from that pressing. He lived in poverty long into adulthood, losing his father to violence when he was young, working factory floors before he found his way to the page. He knew what it was to be constrained by circumstance, and so when he insists on reversing the arrow, when he plants himself in the ancient wisdom that the outer world is more effect than cause, he is not speaking from the untested height of privilege. He is speaking from a different vantage point entirely, from the inside. Marcus Aurelius, emperor, Stoic, a man who governed an empire while war and plague consumed its edges, wrote in his private journals that the things which happen to you do not trouble you. Only your judgments about those things trouble you. He was not being dismissive of suffering. He was naming a distinction that the entire Stoic tradition was built upon, the distinction between event and interpretation, between what occurs and what we tell ourselves it means. This is not a small distinction. It is, in practice, the whole of the matter. An old saying carried through many hands before it lost its first name, the same sun that melts the wax hardens the clay. What a thing does to you depends enormously on what you are when it arrives, and what you are, the texture of your character, the automatic tendencies of your response, the interpretive lens through which all experience is first received. This, Allen argues, is the accumulated deposit of your long habitual thought. Not your studied thought, not your careful, conscious thought. The thought that runs when you are not watching. That is the clay. That is the wax. That determines what the sun will make of you. There was a cartographer who spent his life mapping coastlines. He was precise, methodical, celebrated for the accuracy of his charts. But late in life he made a curious confession. He said, "Every map I drew contained one error I could never correct. The error was this: I always began from where I was standing." His measurements were accurate, his instruments were good, but the place he chose to stand, the angle from which he first took his bearings, that was always his own. And it shaped everything that followed in ways so subtle he could not see them until he compared his maps to those of other cartographers who had stood elsewhere. The coast, he said, does not change, but every mapmaker reveals, in the map, the position from which they saw it. This is what Allen means when he writes that our circumstances are mirrors of our inner state, not perfect mirrors, not simple mirrors, but mirrors nonetheless. The life we map is always, to some degree, the life we have been positioned to see by the long habit of our thought. The practical consequence of this reversal, from seeing yourself as effect to seeing yourself as partial cause, is not guilt. Allen is careful here, though readers sometimes miss his care. He is not saying you caused your suffering through bad thinking and deserve its weight. He is saying something quieter and more radical, that you are not as passive as you feel, that the place you stand can be shifted, that the interpretive lens can be cleaned. Not X, not a wholesale transformation of personality overnight, but Y, a slow, deliberate reorientation of the habitual thinking that is already, always, producing your habitual experience. Epictetus, who was born into slavery and became one of antiquity's most revered teachers, held that the only domain of genuine freedom is the inner one. Not what happens to you, but what you do with what happens. He did not say this was easy. He said it was the only thing that was truly yours. This week, choose one recurring frustration, something in your outer life that you have thought of as simply happening to you. And ask the cartographer's question, from what position have I been observing this? What thought have I been bringing to this encounter, reliably, before it has even begun? You do not have to change the answer immediately. Simply see it clearly. The seeing is the beginning. Effect is visible, cause is interior, and the interior is where all lasting change begins. Chapter 3, The Character You Carved Without a Chisel Somewhere. In the long tradition of the ancient world, there existed a belief so simple it was nearly invisible, that a human being is not a fixed thing, that what you call your character is not a fact about you the way your height is a fact about you. That character is, at every moment, either being built or being worn away, that it is, in a most precise sense, a made thing. This belief has been lost and recovered so many times across human history that we can only conclude it keeps being rediscovered because it keeps being true. James Allen recovered it for the 20th century. He placed it inside a slim book that asked only this: if thought is the chisel and character is the stone, then what are you currently carving? There was a builder who was given in his youth a commission to construct a house. He was young and impatient, and he took certain shortcuts that he told himself were invisible. He used inferior materials where they would be hidden beneath the surface. He rushed the foundations because the foundations could not be seen once the walls were raised. The house, when finished, looked identical from the outside to a house built with full care and attention. For some years it stood well enough. Then came a winter of exceptional severity, and what was hidden in the walls was revealed by the cold. What had been skipped in the foundation was exposed by the pressure of the ground's freezing. The house stood, but it stood differently, with effort, with visible strain at the joints. The builder, older now, rebuilt it entirely. He told his apprentices, "I once believed that what I could not see did not matter. Now I know that what cannot be seen is the only thing that truly matters. The hidden work is the real work." Allen would have recognized this builder. He wrote with conviction that every act originates in thought, and that every repeated thought deepens a groove in the character, invisible at first, then harder to exit the longer it has been traveled. This is what the neurologists of a later century would confirm in their own language, with their own instruments. But Allen did not need instruments. He needed only careful observation of himself. The Upanishads speak of this in their own idiom. The self you inhabit at any given moment is not the final self. It is the self constructed by the choices of all the moments before it. And this is the part that opens everything. The self you will inhabit in the future is being constructed right now from the material of your present thought. The thought you repeat becomes the attitude you carry. The attitude you carry becomes the automatic response. The automatic response, repeated across seasons and years, becomes the character, and the character, finally, visibly, undeniably, becomes the life. This is not mysticism. This is observable. You have watched it happen in people you love. Allen is not describing a process that favors the brilliant or the educated or the spiritually gifted. He is describing a process that operates for everyone, equally, without exception, in both directions. The person who habitually rehearses bitterness in their inner life is carving as surely as the person who habitually returns to gratitude. The mind is always at work. The chisel does not rest. Which means the question is never whether you are shaping your character. The question is only whether you are shaping it with awareness. Seneca wrote in his letters, and it is worth hearing the particular warmth of his insistence on this, that we must tend ourselves the way we tend those we love. He meant with patience, with regularity, without waiting for some dramatic transformation to arrive from outside. He meant do the hidden work. Here is the concrete practice Allen's teaching points toward, and it requires no equipment. Before sleep tonight, choose one quality you wish to develop, not perform, but develop from the inside. Patience, or steadiness, or courage, or clarity. Hold it in your mind for 5 deliberate minutes. Not as an aspiration, but as a description, as if it were already partially true, already taking root beneath the surface you can see. Do this for 7 consecutive nights. Notice what shifts. This is not imagination as escape. This is imagination as construction. As Allen understood it, thought held with intention and repetition as the sculptor's hand on the stone. The character you are living is the one you have been carving, and the chisel is still in your hand. Chapter 4, Thought and Circumstance. The world is a mirror of the inner life. There is a temptation, when we encounter the teaching that thought shapes circumstance, to reduce it immediately to something manageable, to turn it into a technique, to say, very well, I will think better thoughts, and better things will arrive. And then, when better things do not arrive on the schedule we have set for them, to conclude that the teaching was beautiful but untrue. Allen anticipated this. He was not offering a vending machine. He was offering something harder and more durable, a map of causes. The connection between inner life and outer circumstance is not mechanical. It is not a transaction. It is more like the relationship between a river and the landscape it moves through, shaped by the land, yes, but also, over long time, shaping the land in return. The current does not dictate every stone, but the current, maintained long enough, moves mountains. What Alan is saying, and what the Taoist teachers said long before him in different garments, is that the quality of a life is inseparable from the quality of the mind that is living it, not because thought controls all events, but because thought determines in ways both obvious and invisible what we notice, what we pursue, what we tolerate, what we leave, what we build, and what we walk away from. And these choices, accumulated across days and years, are what a life is made of. There was a ferryman who carried travelers across a wide river for many years. He was known throughout the region, though differently by different people. Some travelers arriving at his dock would ask him, "What are the people like in the village on the other side?" He always answered the same way. He asked, "What were the people like in the village you came from?" If they said cold, suspicious, unwelcoming, he would nod slowly and say, "I am sorry to tell you, you will likely find the same on the other side." If they said warm, generous, full of life, he would smile and say, "I am glad to tell you, I think you will find the same waiting for you." After many years, a young apprentice who had watched this exchange repeated many times finally asked the ferryman, "But how can you know what the village across the river is like before they arrive? You give opposite answers to different people." The ferryman said, "I do not know the village across the river. I know the traveler in front of me." And the traveler carries their village with them, and here he touched his chest wherever they go. The river only separates the geography. It does not separate the mind from what it expects to find. The mind does not lie. It only keeps records. What records does your mind carry about the world, about other people, about your own reception in rooms you have not yet entered? These records are not neutral observations. They are active lenses, and they focus your attention, direct your behavior, and in doing so help to produce, with genuine measurable regularity, the very circumstances they predicted. This is what the Taoist tradition calls wu-wei in reverse, effortful, unconscious striving toward outcomes we claim not to want. The person who expects betrayal moves through relationships in ways that provoke it, not because betrayal is inevitable, but because the expectation generates the behavior that invites the confirmation. The inner record is never merely recorded. It is always also broadcast. Alan is not saying this to condemn. He is saying this to illuminate. Because if it is true, then the path is clear. If you wish to change what consistently appears in your outer life, begin by auditing what consistently runs in your inner one. The audit is not dramatic. It does not require retreat or crisis. It requires only this, a willingness to notice, without judgment, the automatic narration that runs beneath your conscious day. The story your mind tells about money, or love, or your own competence, or the trustworthiness of others. The conclusions your mind reached long ago and has been rehearsing ever since, so many times that they feel not like conclusions, but like facts. They are not facts. They are records. And records can be examined, can be questioned, can, over time, be rewritten. Here is the practical step Alan's teaching implies for this week. Choose one recurring circumstance in your life, one that keeps appearing in different forms, with different people and different settings. Ask yourself, without defensiveness, what belief about this situation have I been carrying since before it began? What have I expected, and therefore helped to prepare the ground for? You do not need to answer the question completely. You only need to ask it honestly. The asking alone begins to loosen what has been fixed. Marcus Aurelius returns to this in his journals with the persistence of someone who knows how easily the lesson slips. Your life is what your thoughts make it, not some of it. He means the texture, the coloration, the emotional weather of every ordinary day. Not the events themselves, over which you have partial control at best, but your experience of the events, your relationship to them, your meaning-making. This is thought's territory entirely, and it is always available for revision. The world you consistently encounter is the world your mind has consistently prepared you to meet, and preparation, unlike fate, can be changed. Chapter 5, Thought and Health. What the body silently testifies the body is a faithful witness. It does not editorialize. It does not soften its testimony to spare your feelings or to preserve a comfortable story you have been telling yourself about how you are. It simply carries what is given to it, and over time shows what it has been carrying. James Allen devotes careful attention to this in As a Man Thinketh, more careful attention than many of his contemporaries were willing to give, because he understood that the separation between mind and body that his era largely assumed was not a separation at all. It was a convention, a useful fiction that had outlasted its usefulness. The thought, he writes, is not contained in the head. It is expressed in the whole person. The physician in this story had practiced medicine for 30 years. She was skilled with remedies, respected for her diagnostics, known in 3 provinces for the accuracy of her prognosis. But late in her career she made a change that her colleagues found eccentric and her patients initially found intrusive. She began, before asking about symptoms, to ask about the tenor of a patient's inner life, not about specific events, not about what had happened to them, but about the habitual quality of their thoughts, whether they woke each morning with a sense of dread or a sense of possibility, whether they carried long-held grievances that they returned to the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth, whether there was in their interior life a fundamental orientation toward life or away from it. Her colleagues asked, "What does this have to do with the presenting complaint?" She said, "Everything, or nothing. I cannot know until I ask." Over time, she compiled her own private observation that a remarkable number of chronic conditions improved, sometimes dramatically, in patients who, simultaneously with their treatment, undertook a change in their habitual mental orientation. Not in all patients, not in all conditions. She made no grand claim. She only said, the body remembers what the mind rehearses. And it responds. The Buddhist teachers spoke of this as the unity of mind and form, not as philosophy, but as practical description. The quality of presence a mind cultivates shapes the entire system that houses it. Fear held long enough becomes tension in the muscles, shallowness in the breath, disruption in the digestion, acceleration in the heart. This is not metaphor. This is the body's literal translation of the mind's habitual language. An old saying, passed among healers across many traditions, the face you wear inside eventually becomes the face you wear outside. The body keeps its own kind of score. Allen is not promising that clear thinking cures all illness. He is not dismissing physical causes or the real suffering of the body. He is making a more careful claim that among the causes of physical vitality or its diminishment, thought is not absent, that the mind's habitual character is one of the conditions the body lives inside, that you cannot pour chronic anxiety into a physical system for years without it eventually speaking in the body's language. And the reverse, and this is what makes his teaching genuinely useful rather than merely sobering, the reverse is equally true. Not illness caused entirely by dark thought, that is too simple and Allen knows it, but vitality increasingly possible when the habitual thought is oriented toward steadiness, toward meaning, toward the kind of trust in life that ancient traditions sometimes called faith, and sometimes called courage, and sometimes simply called wakefulness. Seneca, again in his letters, take care of your body, certainly, but remember that the body is the servant of the mind, not its master. He meant, do not let the condition of the body set the condition of the mind. Set the condition of the mind first, and let the body receive that. This was the Stoic hierarchy of attention, inner before outer, always. Here is the concrete practice this chapter suggests. Choose one physical symptom you carry chronically, tension, fatigue, recurring discomfort that has no clear medical explanation, and spend 1 week noticing what thought tends to be present when that symptom intensifies. Not to blame the thought, simply to notice the correlation. The physician's first move was always observation, not intervention. See what the body has been trying to tell you about the record your mind has been running. This is the beginning of listening to the testimony the body has been offering, quietly and without dramatics, for longer than you may have realized. The body does not suffer alone. It suffers or flourishes in the company of the thoughts that inhabit it. Chapter 6, Thought and Purpose. The drift and the current. What is the difference between a life that moves and a life that merely passes? This question has occupied every tradition that has ever taken human existence seriously, and the answers across centuries and continents have converged on something surprisingly consistent. The difference is not talent, not fortune, not the accident of birth into favorable circumstances. The difference is the presence or absence of a ruling thought, a central purpose that organizes the energy of a life the way a riverbank organizes the energy of water. Without banks, water does not travel. It spreads. It becomes marsh. It loses the velocity that comes from constraint and direction. It may cover a great deal of ground while going nowhere in particular. James Allen names this with characteristic plainness as one of the central findings of his entire inquiry, that aimlessness is itself a kind of thinking. That drift is not the absence of thought, but the presence of a thought that has never been examined and corrected. The thought, usually, that runs something like this: whatever I want does not quite apply to me, or I will begin when conditions improve, or purpose is for other people with more certainty than I have managed to find. These are thoughts. They have consequences, and they can be changed. There was a shepherd who had tended the same hillside for many years, following the flock wherever it wished to go. He was not unhappy. The hillside was beautiful. The work kept his hands busy and his body strong, but at the end of each day, when he counted the flock and turned toward home, he noticed that he could not say where the day had gone, not in the sense that time had moved quickly, in the sense that it had moved without him. He had followed rather than led. He had responded rather than directed, and the flock, ungoverned, had gone in circles. An elder in his village, watching this over many seasons, said to him one evening, "The flock is not the problem. The flock will always drift without a shepherd who knows where he is going." "Tell me, where are you going?" The shepherd was quiet for a long time. He had never been asked this question directly. He had thought of himself as someone who takes care of what is in front of him. The elder said, "That is a good thing to be. But caring for what is in front of you without knowing where you are going means what is in front of you will always be determined by someone else's direction, or by accident, or by the random wandering of what you were supposed to be leading." The shepherd went home that night and did not sleep. He was thinking, for perhaps the first time, about where he was going. The book of Ecclesiastes carries this observation in its own tonal register, the melancholy of a mind that has surveyed human activity without purpose and found it vanity. Not because activity itself is worthless, but because activity without a governing direction dissipates itself across too many surfaces to leave any lasting mark. The preacher is not condemning effort. He is asking what the effort is for, and concluding that without an answer to that question, the most vigorous life will feel at its end like water poured on sand. Allen takes this observation and characteristically turns it into instruction. If aimlessness is a thought pattern that can be recognized, it is also one that can be replaced. Not all at once and not without difficulty, but systematically through the cultivation of what he calls central purpose, a ruling idea that the whole energy of the mind can organize itself around. He is careful not to prescribe what that purpose should be. He is not in the business of telling people what to want. He is in the business of telling people that wanting something clearly, specifically, with full intention, and then directing thought consistently toward it is not optional equipment for a meaningful life. It is the engine. Here is the question Allen's teaching poses, plainly enough that it becomes uncomfortable. What is the single thought your mind returns to most consistently, of its own accord, when nothing external is demanding your attention? Because that thought, not the purpose you have named aloud, not the aspiration you have written down, but the thought your mind gravitates toward when it is free. That is what is currently governing your life. And if it is not the thought you would choose, you are capable of choosing differently. This week, spend 10 minutes, not more, writing a single sentence that describes what you are working toward. Not what you think you should want, not what would impress someone watching, what you, in the quiet of your own interior, would most like your remaining days to be organized around. One sentence. Then spend the rest of the week noticing how your daily choices either support or contradict that sentence. The gap between the sentence and the choices is the information. It shows you, without judgment, where thought and purpose have not yet found each other. And seeing that gap clearly is the first step toward closing it. The life that drifts is not rudderless, it is governed by an unexamined thought, and that thought, once seen, can be replaced by one you have chosen. Chapter 7. The Achievement Thought Makes Possible There is a story the world tells about achievement. It goes like this. Some people are built for it, and some are not. The ones who are built for it recognize themselves early, by aptitude, by drive, by the fortunate alignment of talent and opportunity, and they move forward. The ones who are not built for it learn also early to make peace with a smaller life. James Allen finds this story not merely incomplete, but actively misleading. And he takes it apart with the quiet precision of someone who has watched it cause unnecessary suffering in too many lives. Achievement, he argues, is not the product of talent arriving at opportunity. It is the product of thought arriving at readiness. And readiness is something that can be cultivated. It is not distributed at birth like eye color or bone structure. It is built the way all things of lasting value are built, slowly, internally, through the long disciplined application of a governing thought to the material of a human life. There was a potter who learned her craft in the traditional way, under a master who spoke rarely and demonstrated constantly. For the first 2 years, she was permitted only to prepare the clay. She was not allowed to touch the wheel. She watched, she waited, she prepared. Other students grew impatient and left. She stayed. When the master finally allowed her to the wheel, her hands already knew something. Not the technique, she had not practiced the technique. But the quality of attention the technique required, the stillness, the precise balance of pressure and release, the understanding that the clay will not be forced into beauty, it will only be invited. Her first vessels were not remarkable, but they were already organized by something that took other students years to develop, an interior understanding of what the work required of the worker. Seneca wrote that luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. He was describing, in compressed form, exactly what Allen means by the thought that achieves. Preparation is not the accumulation of skill alone. It is the formation of a mind that is ready, that has been thinking the right thoughts long enough that the right action, when the moment calls for it, arrives without hesitation. The Stoics were deeply suspicious of what we now call motivation, the emotional surge that makes difficult things feel temporarily easy. They preferred what they called discipline, the quiet, unglamorous commitment to action independent of how one happens to feel about it on any given morning. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself sternly about this. He noted that he was tempted, on cold mornings, to remain in bed and tell himself he deserved rest. He then asked himself, "Is lying here serving the work I am here to do?" And he rose. Not because rising felt good, because the thought that governed his life was stronger than the feeling that governed his morning. This is what Allen means when he writes that achievement is not about favorable circumstances. It is about a thought that is stronger than the resistance of circumstances, that keeps organizing behavior in its direction even when behavior is difficult, even when the result is not yet visible, even when the people around you have concluded that the effort is not worth continuing. The practical question this chapter places before you is direct. What is the one capability, the one contribution, the one form of genuine work that you have been approaching intermittently, with enthusiasm when it feels possible and with avoidance when it does not, rather than with the steady, temperature consistent commitment of a forge? And what would change if you decided simply that you would show up to it regardless of how you feel about it on any given day? This week, do the thing you have been approaching intermittently, once, without waiting to feel ready. Notice what happens, not to the result, to your relationship with the work. Achievement does not wait for the right conditions, it creates them through the steady heat of a thought that does not cool. Chapter 8, Visions and Ideals. The invisible blueprint before a thing exists in the world, it exists somewhere else. This is not mysticism. It is the ordinary sequence of all made things. The house existed in the architect's mind before the first stone was placed. The melody existed in the composer's interior before the first note was written. The business, the friendship, the journey, the reconciliation, all of it preceded by an image held in a mind that organized the actions that eventually brought it into the tangible world. James Allen calls these images visions and ideals. He is not using these words decoratively. He means them precisely. A vision is a thought about what is possible that is held with enough clarity and consistency to begin directing behavior toward its realization. An ideal is a thought about what is worth becoming, not as performance, but as genuine interior aspiration. He argues, and this is where his teaching becomes most demanding, that the height you reach is substantially determined by the height of the vision you are willing to hold, not because vision alone achieves anything, but because you cannot move consistently towards something you have not first clearly imagined. The invisible blueprint precedes the visible structure, always, without exception. There was a navigator who had crossed open water many times in conditions that would have unmanned less experienced sailors. When younger colleagues asked him the secret of his composure in difficult crossings, he said something they did not expect. He said, "Before I leave the harbor, I have already arrived. I have seen the destination so many times in my mind in such detail. The color of the water as it changes near the coast, the particular quality of the light in that latitude, the sound of the harbor as we enter it, that the crossing itself is simply the work of closing the distance between where I am and where I have already been." They asked, "But what if you cannot see the stars? What if the weather closes in and you have no instruments?" He said, "Then I navigate from the image. The image is always available. The image does not depend on weather. The Kabbalistic tradition speaks of the world of formation, the invisible realm in which all things take their shape before they descend into the world of action. This is not a claim about a literal geography beyond the physical. It is a description of the sequence of creation as it operates through human consciousness, first the image, then the intention, then the sustained effort, then the manifestation. To skip the first step, to try to achieve without first clearly envisioning, is to build without a blueprint. The structure may rise, but it will be irregular, improvised, subject to collapse at the first serious pressure. An old saying that has traveled through many hands, "A ship in harbor is safe, but that is not what ships are built for. The harbor of the familiar is comfortable. But the vision that calls you beyond it, the image of what could be, held clearly and revisited regularly, is the force that makes the leaving possible." Allen is not promising that vision guarantees outcome. He is saying that the absence of vision guarantees a particular kind of outcome, the outcome of drift, of circumstance, of whatever the immediate environment happens to produce. And that this outcome, though it may be comfortable, is rarely the one a person would choose if they permitted themselves to choose clearly. The concrete practice here is simple and often resisted. Spend 15 minutes this week writing a detailed description, not a list of goals, but a description in the present tense, as if you are already there, of what your life looks like when the vision has been realized. What does a typical day feel like? What are you doing with your hands, your mind, your time? Who is with you? What have you stopped doing that you currently do? Write it in detail. Then put it away. Then notice over the following days whether your choices begin to reorganize themselves around the image you have drawn. This is not magical thinking. This is the blueprint preceding the building. This is the navigator leaving the harbor already knowing the harbor on the other side. The life you are willing to clearly imagine is the life you are capable of building, and the imagining is not separate from the building. It is the first act of it. Chapter 9, Serenity. The crown of the disciplined mind, everything we have considered in the preceding chapters, the garden of thought, the law of cause, the character carved in secret, the mirror of circumstance, the body's testimony, the governing purpose, the achievement that thought makes possible, the vision that precedes all form, all of it points finally toward a single quality. Not power, not success in the ordinary sense of that word, not even wisdom, exactly serenity. James Allen places this at the crown of his teaching. He considers it not a reward for those who have achieved everything else, but the very sign that the inner work is genuinely underway. Because serenity is not the tranquility of someone who has been shielded from difficulty. It is the steadiness of someone who has learned, through long discipline of thought, to remain in the presence of difficulty without being dissolved by it. This is a different thing entirely. There was a glass blower who was famous for producing objects of extraordinary delicacy, vessels with walls so thin that light passed through them as if through air, yet strong enough to hold water without trembling. Visitors to her workshop always asked the same question: "How do you make something so fragile, so strong?" She said, "You are misreading what you see. What looks like fragility is the result of evenness. Every part of the vessel is equally thin. There is no point of extra thickness that tries to compensate for weakness elsewhere, and no point of extra thinness that invites collapse. The strength comes from the consistency of the attention given to every part equally, without panic, and without overemphasis. Serenity," she said, though no one had mentioned serenity, is the same. It is not the absence of pressure. It is the even distribution of attention, so that no single point of your life bears more than it can hold. The Sufi teachers, those poets and practitioners of the inner life who have always known that the spiritual journey is not an escape from the world, but a deeper penetration of it, spoke of what they called the tranquil heart, the heart that has been polished through long practice until it reflects rather than absorbs, not a heart that does not feel. A heart that feels fully and is not swept away by feeling, that can hold joy without clutching it, and sorrow without drowning in it. This is the crown Allen speaks of. And he names it the knowledge that as you think, so you are. Not the anxious application of rules and techniques, but the settled, arrived understanding, not merely believed, but known, through the body and the life, that the interior is the origin, and the interior can be tended. The mind does not lie. It only keeps records. And the serene mind, Allen's crowning achievement of inner discipline, is the mind that has examined its records honestly, corrected what could be corrected, accepted what could not, and arrived at a genuine peace with both the process and the uncertainty of the outcome. Not the peace of resignation, not the quiet of someone who has stopped wanting anything, the peace of someone who has stopped confusing the weather of external events with the climate of the interior life, who knows that the climate is theirs to tend, regardless of the weather. Epictetus, in his late teaching, said something that has the quality of a door opening rather than a lecture concluding. He said, "Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have a tranquil flow of life." This has been misread as passivity. It is, in fact, the most demanding kind of engagement, to remain fully present to what is, without the distortion of what you insist it should be, while still working calmly and consistently toward what you envision it becoming. This week, choose one circumstance in your life that has been generating chronic agitation, one thing you have been resisting rather than meeting. Sit with it, not to resolve it, but to practice meeting it without the additional weight of your resistance. Notice how much of your suffering around this circumstance is the circumstance itself, and how much is the thought you are adding to it every time you encounter it. You do not have to like what you find, you only have to see it. That seeing, held with honesty, is the beginning of the serenity Allen considers the highest achievement of a thinking life. Serenity is not the stillness of someone who has been spared. It is the stillness of someone who has learned where the storm actually lives, and has tended that place with such care that the outer weather lost its power to determine the inner one. Chapter 10, The Thought That Heals Verses. The thought that wounds there are thoughts that open the body, and there are thoughts that close it. There are thoughts that widen the horizon of what seems possible, and there are thoughts that reduce it, methodically, until the available world is no larger than the cage of the familiar. There are thoughts that the people around us can feel wordlessly, the way you can feel the temperature of a room before your eyes have had time to adjust to the light. James Allen understood that thought is not a private event. It has consequences that radiate, not in some mystical sense alone, but in the most observable, practical. Daily sense, the thought you carry into a room is the atmosphere you create in it. The thought you carry into a relationship is one of the primary forces shaping what that relationship will become. This chapter is about the difference between the thoughts that heal, in us and others, and the quality of the life we collectively inhabit, and the thoughts that wound, and about the radical possibility that this difference is not fixed by temperament or fate, but is always, in each moment, available for choice. There was a scribe who copied texts for a great library. His work was precise and his memory was exceptional, but he had a habit, noticed only by those who worked closely with him, of adding something to every text he reproduced. Not in the words were always accurate, but in the quality of the reproduction itself. When he copied a text he found beautiful or true, the letters were fractionally larger, the spacing slightly more generous, the page somehow more breathable. When he copied a text he found degraded or false, the reproduction was technically accurate but airless, the letters pressed together. The margins narrowed, the whole page carrying a quality of reluctance. He was not aware of doing this. He had never been told he was doing it. A visiting scholar, examining the library's collection, noticed it immediately. She said to him, "You are in every page you have ever copied. Your judgments, your loves, your contempts, they are all here, invisible in the letter spacing." The scribe was disturbed by this. He asked, "How do I remove myself from the work?" She said, "You do not remove yourself. You improve yourself. The only way to stop putting your wounds into your work is to tend the wounds. The Egyptian mystery schools, those ancient systems of inner education that understood the cultivation of the self as the highest of all possible arts, taught that the quality of the thought a person habitually carries becomes, over time, the quality of their impact on everything they touch. This was not considered a metaphor. It was considered an observable law of the inner world, as reliable as any law of the outer one. Allen brings this into the language of his own era, thoughts of ill will, of resentment, of contempt. Not just the dramatic ones, but the habitual minor ones, the small daily verdicts rendered on other people and on ourselves, these are the thoughts that wound. Not primarily others, though they wound others too, primarily ourselves. They create in the interior a climate of contraction, of vigilance, of perpetual low-grade hostility to the world. That eventually becomes the lens through which all experience is filtered, and thoughts of goodwill, of compassion, of genuine interest in the well-being of others, these are the thoughts that heal. Not as a performance, not as a spiritual technique applied to gain advantage, but as a genuine reorientation of the habitual inner life toward openness rather than closure. Here is what makes this practical rather than merely noble. You cannot sustain thoughts of genuine goodwill toward others while simultaneously maintaining thoughts of contempt toward yourself. The inner climate does not subdivide so neatly. If you cultivate warmth, it tends to spread. If you cultivate contempt, it also spreads. The direction of the spread is a choice you are making, whether or not you have recognized it as one. This week, choose one person toward whom you carry unresolved resentment, not to excuse what they did, not to pretend it did not matter, but to spend 5 minutes deliberately wishing them, in the silence of your own mind, something genuinely good. Notice what this does not to them, but to you. Notice whether the act of wishing goodness outward changes anything in the quality of the interior air you are breathing. This is not weakness. This is the disciplined management of your own inner climate, which is the only climate you actually control. The thought that heals and the thought that wounds are both available to you at every moment, and the one you choose most consistently is the one that will come to define the interior world you and everyone near you must live inside. Chapter 11, Outer Circumstances. Inner Causes, the misread map we misread the map. This is, perhaps, the central practical error that James Allen spent his book correcting. We look at the outer terrain of our life, the circumstances, the relationships, the financial conditions, the recurring patterns of difficulty or ease, and we read them as primary, as given, as the fixed landscape within which we must navigate as best we can. But Allen, standing in the tradition of the Hermetic teaching that the outer world is a projection of the inner one, as above, so below, as within, so without, is asking us to read the map differently, not to deny the outer terrain, not to pretend that circumstances are infinitely malleable by the power of positive thinking, but to recognize that what we take to be the fixed landscape of our life is, to a significant degree, a map we have been drawing ourselves, and we have been reading it as if someone else drew it. There was a surveyor who was commissioned to map a new territory. She was skilled and experienced, and her instruments were accurate. But she had been working in difficult conditions for many weeks, and without knowing it, a subtle error had crept into her baseline measurement, a small degree of deviation that, compounded across the entire survey, meant her map was consistently, systematically displaced from the actual terrain. Everything she recorded was accurate relative to everything else she recorded. The internal consistency of her map was perfect, but the map as a whole was wrong, and travelers who used it found themselves reliably somewhere other than where they intended to be, not dramatically lost, but persistently, inexplicably off. When the error was finally identified and corrected, it was not dramatic. It was a small adjustment to a single baseline measurement. But it changed every subsequent reading, and travelers who used the corrected map found themselves arriving, simply and reliably, where they meant to go. This is what Allen is offering, a correction to the baseline. Not a revolution in the outer life, but a recalibration of the inner measurement from which all outer navigation proceeds. The Hermetic tradition from which Allen drew, the ancient teaching preserved in the texts, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary master who stood at the crossing of the Egyptian and Greek wisdom streams, held that the mind is not a mirror of reality. It is a shaper of reality, not in the sense of making facts be otherwise than they are, but in the sense that the mind selects, from the infinite complexity of what is present, the portion it is prepared to see. And what it is prepared to see is determined by what it has been habitually thinking. An old saying that has found its way into many traditions, the eye sees what the mind is prepared to comprehend. The person who has been thinking for years about scarcity walks into the same room as the person who has been thinking about abundance, and they do not see the same room. This is not poetic license. This is the measurable reality of selective attention, confirmed by every discipline that has studied how human perception actually works. Alan is asking, what has your habitual thought prepared you to see, and what has it therefore reliably prevented you from seeing? Here is the practice this chapter implies. Choose one area of your life where you believe your options are limited, where the terrain seems fixed and the doors seem closed. Write down, as specifically as possible, the thought about this area that you have been carrying, not the situation, the thought about the situation. Then ask, is this thought a fact, or is it a baseline measurement that may contain a small but consequential error? What would you see if you corrected, even slightly, the angle from which you have been taking your bearings? You do not have to see differently all at once. You only have to admit the possibility that what you have been seeing is not all there is to see. The Hermetic Masters did not promise that correcting the inner map would immediately change the outer terrain. They promised something more measured and more durable, that a corrected inner map, navigated consistently and with patience, will bring you, over time, to terrain that the old map could not have found. Because the old map was not mapping the possible, it was mapping the expected. The circumstances you find fixed are often the circumstances you have stopped expecting to change, and that expectation is a thought, and a thought, when recognized, can be corrected. Chapter 12, The Dreamer Who Did Not Sleep. Imagination as architecture. Every tradition that has taken the inner life seriously has eventually arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion. Imagination is not the opposite of reality. It is the anteroom of reality, the place where reality is prepared before it is delivered. This makes most practical people uneasy. We have been taught to value what can be verified, measured, and demonstrated. An imagination, the capacity to hold in the mind what does not yet exist in the world, has been filed under entertainment, under escapism, under the activities permissible only after the real work is done. James Allen disagrees with a precision that leaves little room for comfortable evasion. He argues that imagination is the real work, that the person who does not consciously inhabit their imagination will have their imagination inhabited for them by fear, by memory, by the accumulated imagery of a culture that has a great deal invested in telling you what is and is not possible for someone like you. Not the absence of imagination, but the absence of conscious imagination. This is what leads to the unlit room. There was an architect who designed only spaces she had first inhabited fully in her mind. Before a single measurement was taken, before any conversation with a builder or a client about materials or timelines, she would sit quietly for several hours and simply be in the building. She would walk its imagined corridors. She would notice where the light fell at different hours. She would feel the quality of sound in the main room and the quality of silence in the smallest one. She would ask herself, does this space serve the life that will be lived in it? Only after she was satisfied with the answer would she begin to draw. Her buildings had a quality that other architects studied and could not quite reproduce. Someone eventually asked her what she was doing differently in the drafting stage. She said, I am not doing anything different in the drafting stage. By the time I sit down to draw, the building already exists. I am simply recording it. This is the Upanishadic teaching carried into practice, creation as recognition. The form already present in the interior, waiting to be faithfully rendered in the exterior. Not invention exactly, more like discovery of what the mind has already prepared. Allen is not promising that imagined things automatically materialize. He is not describing a passive process. He is describing the first and most essential step in an active one, that before you can build with your hands, you must build with your mind. and that the quality of what your hands eventually produce is significantly determined by the quality, the detail, the sustained clarity of what your mind held before the building began. This is the opposite of daydreaming in the dismissive sense. Daydreaming wanders. Conscious imagination is disciplined. It returns repeatedly to a specific image. It furnishes that image with detail. It examines it from multiple angles. It asks whether the image serves what is actually desired or whether it is merely pleasant. And then it holds it, not possessively, but steadily, the way the navigator holds the image of the destination harbor available in any weather. The Upanishads describe the highest form of human creativity as the capacity to be a conscious participant in the creative process of existence itself, not to impose your will on reality, but to align your imagination so completely with what is genuinely possible that the gap between the imagined and the actual closes not by force, but by the natural completion of a process already underway. Here is the practice. Tonight, before sleep, spend 10 minutes in the unlit room, the room of pure imagination, and furnish it with one specific vision of something you genuinely want to build or become. Not vaguely. Specifically, with detail sufficient to feel its texture. Stay with it until it feels inhabited rather than merely envisioned. Then sleep, and notice what the next morning brings in the way of impulse, direction, and available action. Do not judge the result too quickly. The architect does not evaluate the building before the foundations are laid. Imagination is not the retreat from the real, it is where the real is first assembled by the only architect who will ever have access to the plan's chapter 13, the complete circle. As a man thinketh, so he becomes we have come, at last, to the place where the circle closes. Not ends. Closes, the distinction matters, because what James Allen teaches in As a Man Thinketh is not a line with a beginning and a terminus. It is a circle, a recognition that thought and character, character and circumstance, circumstance and thought are not a sequence but a cycle, and that the cycle, once recognized, can be entered at any point and turned in any direction. You entered this teaching with a life already in motion. You will leave it with that same life, the same relationships, the same history, the same body, the same address. None of that will have changed. But the relationship you have with what is unchanging may, if this teaching has been genuinely received, have shifted in a way that changes everything that comes after it. That is the quiet revolution Allen is proposing, not the dramatic disruption of outer circumstance, the deep, durable revision of inner premise. The traditions we have visited across these chapters, Hermetic, Stoic, Taoist, Buddhist, Upanishadic, Kabbalistic, the wisdom of Ecclesiastes, the inner science of the Egyptian mystery schools, the Sufi understanding of the polished heart, all of them, in their different languages and different climates, have arrived at the same circle. They have all mapped the same territory from different starting points with different instruments, and their maps compared show the same essential landscape. The interior is the origin. The thought is the seed. The character is the harvest. And the harvest becomes the field in which new seeds are planted. There is no exit from this cycle. There is only the question of whether you are cycling with awareness or without it, whether the seeds are chosen or merely inherited, whether the harvest is examined or only consumed. What is the life you wish to harvest? Not in the sense of reward or recognition. In the most intimate, private sense, what is the quality of being you wish to inhabit in the years that remain to you? What would it feel like from the inside to be the person your best thought has always been reaching toward? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions James Allen was really asking beneath every page of his brief and inexhaustible book. And they are questions that only you can answer, but you can answer them more clearly than you perhaps believe, if you are willing to sit with them long enough to hear what rises. The Upanishads ask, in their most distilled form, what is the self? And their answer, arrived at through centuries of the most rigorous interior investigation the ancient world produced, is this: the self is not fixed. The self is what attention makes it. The self is the record of what has been habitually, consistently, repeatedly held in the inner light. As a man thinketh in his heart, Allen borrowed this phrase from the book of Proverbs, not as religious decoration, but as the most compressed expression he had found of what he had independently come to know. So he becomes. Not what he wishes. Not what he intends. Not what he performs for others. What he thinks. In the heart, which is to say, habitually, privately, in the unguarded hours, when no one is watching and the performance has been set aside. So he becomes. This week, and the week after, and in every ordinary week that follows, the practice is the same: tend the inner garden, correct the inner map, furnish the unlit room, hold the vision, choose the thought that heals over the thought that wounds, return to purpose when drift arrives, and receive serenity not as a destination, but as the natural climate of a mind that has been patiently and persistently attending to the only thing it was ever actually given full authority over, itself, as a man thinketh so in the fullness of time. And the faithfulness of attention, he becomes. We began tonight with a question hidden inside a paradox, a suggestion that the world you inhabit might not be a place you were born into, but a place you have been, quietly and continuously, building. And we promised that by the time we reached this final page, you would understand something about the nature of thought that most people live and die without ever clearly seeing. Here, at last, is what was hidden in the structure of James Allen's book. As a man thinketh is not an argument. It does not build a case and wait for your verdict. It is itself a demonstration, a piece of sustained, clear, disciplined thought, held at a single temperature across every page, written by a man who had already become what he was describing. And the reader who stays with it until the end discovers something strange and unmistakable. They have been changed not by the ideas, but by the sustained contact with the quality of mind that produced them. This is the secret Allen embedded in the architecture of his work. You cannot spend time in the presence of a genuinely serene, genuinely purposeful, genuinely clear piece of thinking without some of that quality transferring, not into your beliefs, but into your body, into the pace of your breath, into the temperature of your inner climate. You have been, for the duration of this narration, inhabiting a mind that had learned to think well, and that inhabitation is its own teaching, beyond anything that can be summarized. Imagine, now, an elder gardener, one who has tended the same garden for the whole of a long life, and who knows, at last, every corner of it. A student comes to her in the final season and asks, if you could say everything you have learned in a single sentence, what would it be? She is quiet for a long time. The garden moves around her in its ordinary, inexhaustible way. Then she says, tend what you cannot see. The visible takes care of itself. James Allen wrote As a Man Thinketh in 1903. He died 9 years later at 47, having published more than 19 books in the final decade of his life, a decade of extraordinary creative flowering that began only after he left factory work and committed fully to the inner life he had been secretly cultivating for years. The book has never gone out of print. It has been pressed into the hands of the grieving and the searching and the quietly determined for more than a century, because what it contains does not age. Because the garden it describes is the same garden it has always been. Because the law it names was operating before Allen named it and will operate long after every name for it has been forgotten. The circle is complete, but the garden continues. Tend the thought. The life will follow.